But first, I wanted to take a step back and talk about why all of this matters. At the core of Summit County Safe Passages is this concept of habitat connectivity. So what does that mean exactly? Habitat connectivity is the ability of wildlife to move from one habitat to another to access resources such as to find food and water or hunt for prey, to raise their young, to disperse into new areas, to access seasonal resources. A connected landscape allows plants and animals to move around as they need and access the resources they need. But when landscapes become fragmented, wildlife populations also become fragmented. Connected landscapes are really important to us here in Colorado. Each year, Colorado's economy receives $5.1 billion from wildlife viewing, hunting, and fishing. So this really highlights the importance of conserving these lands for all wildlife in Colorado. We all know that wildlife in Colorado are facing a lot of pressure from a lot of different sources, whether it's new housing, energy development, or new recreational trails. But one of the biggest threats to connectivity is roads. Imagine being a deer or bear trying to cross all this traffic. As Colorado's population continues to grow, so does the amount of traffic on our roadways. And more people on the road means more barriers to wildlife movement, preventing animals from accessing the resources they need. And this presents a heightened risk of wildlife-related car accidents. Each year in Colorado, there's over 3,600 collisions with wildlife are reported to law enforcement. This includes collisions with wildlife that result in 266 accidents where people are injured and an average of 3.3 human fatalities. Many more collisions, especially with small animals, go unreported. Colorado Parks and Wildlife estimates that up to 2% of some wildlife populations are killed annually on Colorado's roads. And each year in Colorado, there is many mule deer killed in wildlife vehicle collisions as are hunted. In some areas, collisions with vehicles are the single highest source of wildlife mortality. The cost of these collisions to Colorado citizens is estimated at $80 million annually. And this is for expenses such as insurance and medical bills, car repairs, and emergency services. And it doesn't include the value of the wildlife killed or the impacts to those wildlife populations. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are solutions to this problem. Wildlife crossing structures, including overpasses and underpasses, are proven to be the most effective solution to creating safer roads for wildlife and people. Reconnecting the landscape with wildlife crossing structures not only keeps wildlife populations healthy, which has associated ecological, social, and economic benefits, but it also makes our roads much safer for motorists as well. Across North America, wildlife crossing structures and wildlife fencing have been shown to reduce wildlife-related car accidents by upwards of 95%. This is an example of an overpass. This is actually Colorado's very first overpass, which was built on State Highway 9 just south of Kremling. Go to the next slide. And this is another example of an overpass. This one is in Banff National Park up in Canada. And this is an example of an underpass. This one is also on Colorado State Highway 9. And this is showing you a mule deer who just used it to safely pass under the highway. The crossing structures that were recently built on State Highway 9 are a really good example of how effective wildlife crossing structures can be. In 2016, 5 underpasses and 2 overpasses were completed on roughly a 10-mile stretch of Highway 9, just south of Kremling in Grand County. And since completion, these structures have reduced wildlife vehicle collisions with mule deer and elk by nearly 90%. So before the structures were built, we saw 5.6 hits per year, and now that the structures are built, that's down to 7. Mule deer use the 7 wildlife crossing structures over 83,000 times in the first 4 years. So without this mitigation, each of these crossings, all 83,000 of those crossings could have resulted in a wildlife vehicle collision because those animals were crossing on the roadway in line with traffic. So this really illustrates how effective these structures can be. I want to take a minute here just to talk a little bit about why you might choose to build an overpass versus an underpass. And it's really dependent on the landscape and the species that you're trying to get across the landscape. If you go out and check the structures on State Highway 9, you'll see that the 5 underpasses were built where natural drainages come up to the roadway, and it really makes sense to continue those drainages under the roadway with an underpass. The overpass are similar in that they're in places where the road was cut out of the landscape, so reconnecting the landscape with an overpass made sense. But you also have to consider which species you're trying to get across the landscape and how they might be using that landscape. The area that the State Highway 9 structures are in is in mule deer winter habitat. So we see animals making daily movements across the roadway there. Some species are going to be more willing to use a variety of structures, while others, like elk, are a little more picky. So you need to make sure that if you're going to build something for elk, that they have a nice line of sight and they're not going to feel too constricted by whatever structure you've put in for them. A cool thing that we have seen on State Highway 9 is we have documented mule deer actually teaching elk to use a underpass on State Highway 9. So that's kind of a fun story. But really the best thing you can do if you're building wildlife crossing structures is just to have a variety of structure types for wildlife to use within a given landscape. And so here, I've been lucky enough to be part of the team, which is finishing up a 5-year study looking at the effectiveness of these structures. We're working with Eco Resolutions and Colorado Parks and Wildlife and the Department of Transportation. And this is a video of mule deer using the overpass while I was actually out. I was checking cameras one day, and they decided to cross over the structure while I was up there. I don't know if you can hear it or not, but you can actually hear the cars driving below us as the deer cross safely. So there had been momentum. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, there had been momentum before the State Highway 9 project, but that really started the ball rolling for some pretty significant steps here in Colorado. In 2017, Colorado Department of Transportation and Colorado Parks and Wildlife held the first ever Wildlife and Transportation Summit. The purpose of which was to establish partnerships and develop an action plan to improve highway safety and protect wildlife populations in their movement corridors. From this came the Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance, which was established in 2018 as a statewide coalition between the Colorado Department of Transportation, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and also federal, tribal, academic, nonprofit, and engineering partners. And then in 2019, Governor Polis signed an executive order which directs state and wildlife transportation agencies to identify policy and regulatory opportunities to promote the conservation of seasonal big game habitat and migration corridors. So there's been some pretty significant movement here in Colorado over the last couple of years. But meanwhile, there's also been several grassroots initiatives leading the way to conserve habitat and improve connectivity for wildlife, as well as address motorist safety at the local level. Such efforts are crucial as more and more people move to and visit Colorado, putting extreme pressure on the state's wildlife species. One such effort is Summit County Safe Passages Connectivity Plan for Wildlife. This plan is the product of a year-long collaborative effort among agencies, local governments, nonprofits, community groups, landowners, and other interested parties to provide a common vision and specific recommendations for protecting wildlife movement corridors and reducing wildlife-related collisions on Summit County's roadways. This project was actually born out of an off-site mitigation effort between the Forest Service and the Department of Transportation for a realignment project on State Highway 9 near Frisco. After seeing so many projects and developments occur in Summit County, the Forest Service and the Department of Transportation decided to take a time out and try to understand how all of this development is affecting the way wildlife moves through the landscape. So they decided to use the mitigation funds for that project Rather than doing on-site mitigation, they decided to use the funds instead for countywide connectivity assessment and in addition to some other off-site wildlife projects such as restoring stream and terrestrial habitat. This connectivity assessment quickly expanded to a larger community stakeholder group. And I threw this map in here just in case anybody needed an orientation of where Summit County is in Colorado. Hopefully you can see the little inset map that Summit County, so you can see that Summit County is on the west slope of Colorado, across the Continental Divide from Denver and the Front Range. And as you can see in the map, Summit County is mostly Forest Service land with some private Bureau of Land Management, state and local government lands. So the goals of the Summit County Safe Passages was to create a common vision for connected landscape for wildlife movement through the county, as well as improve motorist safety. Recognizing from the outset that connectivity isn't just about where wildlife cross roads, but ensuring that our wildlife has the freedom to roam across the landscape to access the habitats and resources they need, we wanted to make sure to align these efforts across jurisdictional boundaries. Using existing data and expertise, the plan recommends the best locations for crossing structures and compatible land management actions for different types of wildlife and wildlife movement areas, recognizing connectivity as one of many values informing land use decision making. The plan is designed to be a guide to help decision makers across agencies and organizations to integrate wildlife movement needs into transportation projects, land use and land management in Summit County. And in order to ensure that limited dollars are spent on projects supported by the community with maximum benefit to wildlife, the effort brought together stakeholders to work towards this vision. So the end result was a plan that identifies 17 wildlife linkages throughout the county. You can see here on the map, all of the linkages are highlighted in blue. And in order to make the plan, we embarked on a process to develop maps, model habitat, and prioritize important areas for wildlife movement across the county. We used a two-tier prioritization process. Tier 1, we looked at biological and safety values. How important is the connection to the health of the species population? Are the species that use the connection threatened or endangered? What is the level of risk of a wildlife vehicle collision for drivers in the area? And then tier 2, we looked at urgency and opportunity. How threatened is the connection? Are there protected lands nearby? How feasible will it be to construct a wildlife crossing? Are there unique opportunities that will facilitate funding and construction? The strength of this effort is in the diversity of the stakeholders that were engaged throughout the process. As you can see from all these logos, we have federal and state agencies, local municipalities, key areas, as well as nonprofit and conservation organizations. And perhaps the most important stakeholder, which doesn't have a logo up here, the citizens of Summit County and the neighboring towns and visitors and landowners of the county. Two logos I know we're missing are the town of Frisco and the town of Silverthorne, that are partners and supporters in this effort. So having a plan is all good and well, but we didn't want to stop at just having a really nice document that goes on a shelf. We wanted to actually implement what the recommendations are in the plan. So the stakeholder group identified priority linkages to begin working on in the near term. Of the 17 identified linkages, 3, the Lower and Upper Blue River and the Vail Pass Wildlife Byway, have been identified by the Summit County Safe Passages stakeholder group as priority initiatives to focus on implementing in the near term. To give a little information on a couple of them, located on State Highway 9 between Silverthorne and the Green Mountain Reservoir, the Lower Blue linkage provides important year-round habitat for mule deer, elk, moose, as well as carnivores such as black bears and mountain lions. And then located on State Highway 9 south of Breckenridge and to the town of the Blue River, the Upper Blue River linkage is important habitat for moose and allows deer, elk, and dispersing Canada lynx to move across the valley, which is experiencing increasing development and traffic. The third area is the Vail Pass Wildlife Byway, which is located on I-70 between Copper Mountain Ski Resort and the top of Vail Pass. And I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail in a bit. So these are some of the things that the effort has accomplished in order to keep the plan from collecting dust. We established a nonprofit organization, Summit County Safe Passages, with Rocky Mountain Wild as a fiscal sponsor. We've created a really nice website, www.summitcountysafepassages.org. And we held work sessions with county commissioners who subsequently formally endorsed the plan. This endorsement ensures that the Summit County Safe Plan will inform future updates to county master planning and zoning and supports collaboration between Summit County Safe Passages and county planners to improve wildlife-friendly ordinances. We've also done a ton of community outreach. We hosted a bunch of, we've done a couple of film screenings. Cascade Crossroads is a film about crossing structures that were built in Washington. We've done some stakeholder site visits to get folks out to the sites where we have proposed crossing structures, just so that they can see what we're trying to do on the landscape. And then we've had booths at a lot of local community events throughout last year. And just announced this morning that Summit County Safe Passages is a recipient of Colorado Parks and Wildlife 2020 Northwest Region Partner of the Year Award. And Ashley Nettles, who's a biologist with the Forest Service and has spearheaded this effort from the very beginning, won the 2020 Public Lands Alliance Partnership Award for agency leadership. Now I want to talk a little bit more about a priority initiative that Rocky Mountain Wild has been the most involved in, and that's what we're calling the Vail Pass Wildlife Byway. This area is located on Interstate 70 between Copper Mountain Resort and the summit of Vail Pass, and it connects important high elevation elk and mule deer summer range habitat, and it provides important habitat for the success of a local breeding population of Canada lynx, which is one of the few known breeding populations of lynx outside of Southwest Colorado. Nearly every species of wildlife in Colorado's Rocky Mountains has been documented using the habitat adjacent to this stretch of I-70. As you can see here on the map, all the green is Forest Service land. The lighter green to the north is the Eagle's Nest Wilderness, and the darker green to the south is land that's managed by the Forest Service for wildlife movement. So in general, this is a really pretty intact landscape. However, Interstate 70 and its constant flows of traffic, on average, this stretch sees 22 vehicles a day, 22,000 vehicles a day. And so this is effectively bisects wildlife movements north and south of the interstate here. This much traffic really presents a significant barrier to wildlife, and many animals don't even try to cross the highway here. And those that do, unfortunately, are often unsuccessful. Research from Wyoming shows that deer need, I think on I-80 in Wyoming, shows that deer need 30 seconds to consider crossing and 60 seconds, a break in traffic of 60 seconds to actually cross. I was out there last summer on an average Wednesday morning, and I could not find a 60-second break in traffic that a deer would want to try to cross. So 22,000 vehicles a day is pretty significant. As you can see in the map, I-70 here is divided highway with a wide natural median, and there are currently 5 span bridges under the eastbound highway lane, but only 1 on the westbound lanes, and currently no direct connections between these existing structures. So Summit County Safe Passages plan envisions 3 wildlife crossing structures to allow for the safe passage of wildlife in this area. The 3 new structures are an overpass at 192.3, an underpass at milepost 193, and another underpass at milepost 193.5. The green stars on the map show you where all the existing structures are, and the yellow are the proposed structures. This is a picture from the proposed overpass location. If you can see in kind of in the background on the right side, I guess that's the right side of the picture is one of the existing span bridges under the eastbound lanes that wildlife, after they use an overpass in this area, would be able to use to get across the eastbound lanes. And this is an example of one of the existing span bridges, one of the existing structures that are currently on I-70. This is the one structure that is on the westbound lanes of traffic. And you can see that it's a very nice, big, open bridge that wildlife can very easily use to move safely under the highway. So what's the status of the Vail Pass Wildlife Byway? We have received $205,000 in funding from Vail Resorts, Arapahoe Basin Ski Resort, and the Center for Large Landscapes to begin a design and feasibility study. Concept development has been contracted out with Wood Consulting and is currently underway, which is very exciting. This study is looking at the three proposed locations, and it's going to determine which type of structure makes the most sense and is the most feasible at each location. It's also going to help us narrow down the cost estimate for these structures, which is really going to help us with fundraising. We're looking for funds to complete the design over the next year, which is we're looking for about $900,000. And our goal is to get this project shovel ready, which is really, once the project is shovel ready, it really helps to open it up to additional funding sources so we can make construction happen. Some other things that we're trying to do to move this particular project forward. Last summer, we hosted a bunch of public site visits for our partners and donors. These are all pictures we took on some wildlife cameras that we have out there for some monitoring that I'm going to talk about on the next slide. And you can see we had a whole slew of folks come out to join us. Folks from ski areas, city and county officials came, Parks and Wildlife, Department of Transportation, Forest Service, the general public, all sorts of folks we brought out to the proposed crossing locations to show them, so that we could show them the landscape that we're trying to connect and talk about how we're trying to do that. Another thing that we're doing up there is Rocky Mountain Wild and Denver Zoo are partnering on a citizen science initiative called the Colorado Corridors Project to monitor wildlife in the area surrounding the proposed overpass and the two underpasses that were identified in the Summit County Safe Passages Plan. And the goal of this monitoring is to collect information about wildlife in the area so that we can determine which species are going to use the structures once they're built, and then also assess the effectiveness. It's going to give us data that we can use to assess the effectiveness of the structures once they're built. For the past 5 years, we've been collecting data at just the overpass location. We've had nearly 200,000 photos of wildlife and photos of nearly every wildlife species known in Colorado's mountains. Next summer, we're going to expand this monitoring to include the two underpass locations. We were hoping to do that this year, but we had to take a pause due to restrictions with having volunteers out there and COVID. Another cool part of the Colorado Corridors Project is we developed a project on the Zooniverse platform, where we upload all of our photos that we collect each year, and then we can have the general public help us catalog them. Zooniverse is a really user-friendly website. We have all sorts of filters and user guides and all sorts of things to help people identify, even if they're not very familiar with the wildlife in the area. Unfortunately, we don't have any photos that need cataloging right now. Our volunteers are very quick and they get them cataloged very quickly. So, but you should go check out Zooniverse, and there's a lot of different projects up there that you can check out from all across the world. And you can look at our project. If you go to zooniverse.org and you search for Colorado Corridors Project, you can take a look at what our projects looks like. And then hopefully next year we'll have some more photos for you to help catalog. That's the end of the presentation. I just wanted to finish with these are just some best of photos from our wildlife monitoring over the last 5 years. So you can just go ahead and scroll through those.
Thank you so much, Paige. That was great. I love looking at all those pictures. Let me know if anyone wants to go back and look at them a little bit more in depth. I know I went through them kind of quickly so that we could get to the question section. It was great to see how many different animals were using the passages. That was super cool to see that huge wide range. So we would love to take some questions in the chat section just to organize it a little bit better. We have a few to begin with, but does anyone have any questions to begin with? So let's start with what is like the biggest difference between an under and an overpass page, and what different animals use each different type of structure.
Sure. So, I mean, obviously the biggest difference is the way that they get animals across the road. Underpasses go under the road, overpasses go over the road. And it really just depends on the landscape and the species that are present. That'll determine which ones you want to try to build. Some species are less particular, and they're going to use most any structure that you put up there. On State Highway 9, we've seen black bears using the underpasses, and there's some smaller culverts that they'll use. But like I mentioned in the presentation, elk are very particular, and maybe you could build an underpass that they'll use, but it has to be big enough, and they have to have a nice line of sight through the structure, and they can't feel constrained through the structure. So anytime you're deciding between an overpass and an underpass, you really just have to think about what the landscape looks like. You don't want to build an overpass when there's a nice drainage that meets the roadway that you could nicely go under the road, and what species are out there. On Vail Pass, we're proposing a kind of a system of structures. The existing span bridges are really nice and big and good for pretty much any species of wildlife. But the 3 proposed structures are, the reason that it's an overpass and 2 underpasses, there's a reason for that, and just that we just want to give species in the area kind of a choice of a variety of structures to be able to use.
Okay, thank you. Super helpful. We're getting in quite a few questions, so thank you everyone who's asking. Next up is, with the existing overpass on I-70, is wildlife using it a lot so far? So how successful is that existing overpass?
Well, there currently is an existing overpass. Everything that I talked about tonight is proposed, so they haven't been built yet. Okay. I mean, I guess there's the land bridge at the Eisenhower Tunnel, which I'm not exactly sure who is using that. It's a nice natural crossing for wildlife, but it's also in above tree line, so there'll be not everybody is going to be able to access it and use it. So I'm not sure if there's another structure that you're thinking about on another overpass on I-70 that you're thinking about. Or
Um,
of the State Highway 9 structures.
who asked that question? I'm not entirely sure. If whoever asked that question wants to clarify in the chat, that'd be great. So next up is, this might have been mentioned, but how are those photos taken, especially the ones at night? So how are like the camera traps set up and stuff?
Sure. So we, for that monitoring, we had 25 cameras that we set up, remote triggered cameras. So we go set them up and then they're just triggered by movement. And then at nighttime, they use an infrared flash, so not white flash. That allows us to take photos at nighttime.
Okay, cool. That's interesting. What was the biggest challenge you've had to overcome this far in the work?
I mean, I think for really pretty much any crossing structure project, I think funding is going to be the biggest challenge. Trying to find funding for crossing structures. Currently, there isn't a a set funding source for wildlife crossing structures. Vail Pass is kind of a unique project in that it's kind of a standalone wildlife mitigation. A lot of times wildlife mitigation is included in highway widenings or other infrastructure projects. So Vail Pass kind of has its own, like the only reason that we're building those structures is for wildlife. We're not adding lanes or anything up there. So it's going to be a community effort to try and find funding for those structures up there.
Of course. And then on funding, have you asked any auto insurance companies if they'd be interested in working in that funding?
That's a very good question. I don't think we have asked them yet. We're currently kind of working on our strategy for our fundraising strategy. Over the next several months, we're going to be, and I think they will be on our list to reach out to talk to them about it.
Okay, cool. What was the main response from the community? Was it mostly supportive?
Yeah, in general, folks are supportive of wildlife crossing structure projects. I mean, they're helping wildlife, but they're also improving safety for traveling motorists. I think State Highway 9 is a good example. I think that was really brought forward by a citizen group that I believe the person who was headed the citizen group had lost both of his parents in a wildlife vehicle accident on State Highway 9. So in general, communities are supportive of crossing structure projects. There can be kind of individual issues with maybe specific site locations where the landowner on either side maybe has issues with building crossing structures for various reasons. Maybe they don't want the wildlife fencing on their land, or there might be restrictions. They're just concerned about restrictions. But a lot of times, talking to folks and figuring out what those issues are, and maybe moving the location a little bit, usually there can be a solution found.
Okay, cool, great. Are hunting groups some of your financial supporters? Is that included in the support?
Yeah, so Mule Deer Fanatics is a big supporter. Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation is a supporter. Yeah, hunting groups are supporters.
Okay, and then on that topic as well, someone asked that you mentioned getting support from a wide variety of groups. Was it pitched differently to different stakeholders, or how did you go about the pitching process?
Well, we invited folks to sit around the table with us, so everybody was having the same conversation. As we move forward with the feasibility study and with construction, there will be additional conversations with even more groups, and those might be more individualized conversations.
Okay, and how is the whole corona affecting the way that you're going about your work? Is that making a large impact?
It's making a pretty significant impact. Like I said, we had planned to go out and do monitoring this year, but we are not able to do that because we just with restrictions of how many volunteers we'd be able to have out there, it just really didn't make sense to do a big expansion. So we're gonna take a break and get out there next year.
Okay.
But we're still going to set up some cameras this year just to, we've only been at the overpass location for the past 5 years, so we're going to set up some cameras at the other locations just to get some anecdotal outreach and education photos.
Okay. Great. Yeah, I mean, makes sense. This is a little bit, I have a few questions in one. So what prompted the USFS and the CDO to use funds for mitigation, and our maintenance, and how are maintenance costs over time figured into a structure's construction cost? I can repeat that if you want me to. Sorry, it's kind of wordy.
No, so the first question was about the Forest Service and the Department of Transportation, and I think how they decided to use the mitigation funds for the assessment. I think what had happened was the opportunities for on-site mitigation in the area of that particular alignment project just didn't make a whole lot of sense. So they decided to take a step back and they said, like, there's a lot going on in Summit County right now. Why don't we take a step back, and instead of using that money for on-site mitigation, let's use it for an assessment. And then they did some other habitat projects off-site, but the on-site mitigation just wasn't going to do a whole lot. So they felt like they could better use that money elsewhere. And then remind me the second question.
Is maintenance / how are maintenance costs over time figured into a structure's construction cost? So how much is maintenance considered in the once you're figuring out the cost of that final structure?
That is a good question. And I actually, off the top of my head, I don't know the answer to that. I don't want to say one way or another. I mean, I know maintenance is a consideration, whether it's part of, I would guess that it's not part of the construction cost because that's construction, but I don't know for sure. I can follow up with that.
Okay, great, thank you. And then, are there any organizations that focus specifically on smaller mammals and reptiles versus larger game?
With for connectivity?
Yeah, for connectivity.
I mean, I would say that Rocky Mountain Wild, we're not a big game organization. Like we want to make sure that mule deer and elk and moose are moved safely across the roadway, but we're just as concerned about making sure that all the smaller species like raccoon and fox and bobcat and Canada lynx for sure are able to get across. And our partners, Denver Zoo, are also, in the same boat, that they're also concerned with those other smaller species. But the mule deer and elk, they present, they're kind of a good target species because maybe that's not the right word, but because they present a safety problem, they're able to kind of unite everybody around this issue of connectivity. We want to make sure that they're getting across the road safely, both for each of those individual animals that are crossing the road, but also to prevent wildlife vehicle collisions.
Okay, makes sense. And is there a typical range of time for these feasibility studies?
This feasibility study is going to be completed by the end of this year, by this fall. But it's only really going to get us to about 10% design. Ideally, we would get the other 90% by, within a year or two to really keep the momentum going. But we currently don't have funding for that. But we're working on figuring out our strategic plan to get that additional funding.
Okay, of course. Then someone asked to clarify, does the wildlife use the current land bridge right now?
I believe they do, but I don't know what the diversity of species that would use that land bridge. I think because it's at such a high elevation, it's gonna have a limited or a subset of wildlife species that will use it. But yes, I'm sure that species are using it.
Okay, of course. And have you done any outreach on virtual events for Earth Day or other notable days or weeks this year?
We have been doing some outreach, not necessarily specific to this project. You know, we really we took a break for a few months. We're just starting to get some of our partners were really impacted by everything going on with COVID. So we had to take a break for a few months. We're starting to get some reconvene, and I think we'll be looking at some virtual, potential virtual opportunities this summer and this fall.
Okay, of course. And then this is a question relating back to the cameras. Do you use different sensing technologies, or do you use different advanced technology like satellite radar? Or is it just simple cameras are set up to capture the animals?
In this area for this project, for the Colorado Corridors project, it's just the cameras that we're using.
Okay. And do habituated animals have a wider tolerance for smaller structures?
I think, like, yeah, it really depends on the population of animals that you're looking at. And there are populations that might be more habituated to humans or and have a higher tolerance. I think like in Golden over here on the Front Range is a good example of an elk herd that likes to use a golf course across that, and they have to cross a road to get to it. And there is, you know, I think they're proposing to put in an underpass, which, you know, that herd, because they are habituated to the area and more habituated to human presence, is more likely to use that underpass.
Okay, great. Are there any misconceptions among lay people about what wildlife corridors are and how they impact habitat connectivity?
I think maybe one misconception is, you know, when we're talking a lot about crossing structures, that the crossing structures themselves are the wildlife corridors, when the crossing structures are just one piece. And it's an important piece, but it also, you have to look at the greater landscape beyond where the crossing structure is. And then I think the other piece is that, you know, wildlife crossing structures are expensive, and whether they're worth it. And I think if we remember that $80 million number that I put out there that Coloradans spend on wildlife vehicle collisions each year, I think across the United States, it's something like $12 billion we spend on wildlife vehicle collisions. And then you think of that 90%, 95% reduction of wildlife vehicle collisions when you put these crossing structures in. Those two numbers really kind of, it goes to say that I think they're worth the money.
Okay, makes sense. And then what are some of the biggest factors keeping you from reaching these goals?
Really, it's money. That's the biggest factor. You know, we have a very diverse group of folks who are supportive of this. Certainly we still have work to do. Even if we had all the funding, there were still conversations that we'd have to have. But I think funding is the number one biggest obstacle for making this a reality.
Okay. Great. Well, okay, Elizabeth, one more question. Do you ever have conversations with realtors, like real estate agents?
Yeah, not for the Vail Pass project, just because it is mostly surrounded by Forest Service. We are talking a lot with Copper Mountain, and then there's some there's homeowners in the Copper Mountain area that we're talking with and seeing, getting their thoughts on how we might be able to do some fundraising, since this linkage is really in their backyard. But not so much with the realtors. I don't know if the other efforts on State Highway 9, if they have talked with realtors or not.
Okay. Well, I think that is it for questions, unless anyone has anything else to add last minute. Thank you, Paige. Thanks for answering all those questions too. Your presentation was great. Someone did want me to go back to the website that you guys have, so sorry. I'm just gonna flip through all of them. We can take a minute to look at all the pictures
If you go to
again.
the last slide, I have the website on the last slide.
Oh, okay. Here we go again. I mean, these pictures are great, so. Okay, here we are. So yeah, here's Paige's contact. I'm assuming everyone's welcome to reach out to you if they have any questions.
Of course.
Okay, great. So everyone can take a minute to just look at this, go to those links. And then we would like to thank you on behalf of the Endangered Species Coalition. As I mentioned earlier, we do have a petition that we're super close to reaching our signatures on. So if you haven't signed that yet, make sure to do so. The link is down here. And then if you have any questions or would like to get involved even more, please feel free to reach out to Gwen. She can definitely help you guys out. And then if you would like to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, we just started on both of those platforms, and both of them are at Western Slope Connectivity. So please give us a like or a follow. It would definitely be appreciated. I'm sure that Paige listed her. Yeah, there's a Facebook for Rocky Mountain Wild, Summit County. So make sure you check all of that out. And if you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to anyone involved. As Ed mentioned in the chat, on July 1st, our next series, we will be having a speaker, which is Ed, who will address the policy and funding surrounding wildlife crossings more extensively. So that should be super interesting. So please make sure that you stay tuned for that. Paige's email is listed up here right again. Thank you, Betsy, for asking. So take a minute if you need to write it down or copy it. But if anyone has any more questions, feel free to ask. Gwen, do you have anything to add, or Elizabeth?
I would just say thanks everyone for coming again, and we're going to be having these spotlights every couple weeks. So if this just kind of whet your curiosity and you're excited to learn more, we've got an awesome lineup of speakers over the next couple months. And thank you again, Paige, for kicking us off. This was a great presentation, and I personally learned a lot.
Good. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Paige. All right, well, I guess that is everything for tonight. Thank you everyone for joining. We really appreciate it. And thanks again, Paige.